The day we buried my son, my daughter-in-law handed me a motel key and said, "You need to learn how to survive on your own now." I stood beside Daniel's grave holding a wilted white rose while the November wind pushed cold air through my black wool coat. The cemetery workers were already folding chairs near the tent. People were leaving in small groups, speaking in soft voices, their shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass. I remember staring at the polished wooden casket disappearing beneath the earth and thinking that no mother should ever outlive her child. Daniel had been 42 years old. 42. I still remembered the little boy who used to run barefoot through our backyard in Ohio with grass stains on his knees and popsicle juice on his shirt. And now all I had left was a funeral program trembling in my hands. Vanessa stood a few feet away near the black SUV, perfectly composed in a fitted dark coat and leather gloves. Not a strand of her blonde hair had moved all afternoon. People kept hugging her, telling her how strong she was. She thanked them with small, elegant smiles while I could barely feel my own legs beneath me. I thought she was walking toward me to ask if I needed help getting home. Instead, she held out a small motel key attached to a faded plastic tag. Room 214. Maple Crest Inn. "What's this?" I asked quietly. My voice sounded unfamiliar. "Finn." Vanessa avoided my eyes for a second before speaking. "You can't stay in the house anymore, Helen." I honestly thought I had misheard her. The wind rattled the bare trees behind us. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rang once. "I don't understand," I whispered. Vanessa let out a slow breath, the kind people use when they're pretending to be patient. "Daniel's gone now. Things are different. I need space to move forward, and honestly." She glanced toward the parking lot where a few relatives still lingered near their cars. "Don't be dramatic about this. Pack your bags and learn to survive on your own." For a moment, I simply stared at her. My fingers tightened around the motel key until the edge dug into my palm. I wanted to believe grief was speaking for her, that no decent human being would say something like that to a mother who had just buried her only son. Then Ethan appeared beside the SUV. My grandson looked pale beneath the gray sky. His eyes moved nervously between us. "Mom," he asked softly. Vanessa immediately changed her expression. Her face softened like a curtain dropping over a stage. "Sweetheart, your grandmother just needs a little time somewhere quiet to rest." I looked at Ethan. He was 17 years old, tall like Daniel, with the same tired blue eyes. He looked confused, uncomfortable, like he knew something was wrong, but didn't know whether he was allowed to say it out loud. I slipped the motel key into my coat pocket and nodded once. "Of course," I said calmly. "I wouldn't want to inconvenience anyone." Vanessa gave a small, relieved smile, already turning toward the car. Around us, the cemetery emptied little by little until only the sound of cold wind remained. And standing there beside my son's grave, I realized I hadn't just lost Daniel that day. I had lost the family I thought I still had. The drive back to the house felt longer than usual. Rain had started falling sometime after we left the cemetery, soft drops tapping against the windshield like quiet fingers. Ethan sat beside me in silence, while Vanessa drove with both hands tight on the steering wheel. The radio was off. No one spoke. I watched familiar streets pass by in blurred gray streaks and tried to understand how my life had changed so completely in a single afternoon. 3 days earlier, I had still been setting out Daniel's favorite coffee mug every morning without thinking. Now my son was buried beneath cold earth, and I was carrying a motel key in my coat pocket like a stranger passing through town. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed the porch light was already on even though it was barely 4:30 in the afternoon. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. The same white shutters Daniel painted 2 summers ago. The same maple tree near the mailbox with leaves covering the lawn. But something about it felt distant now, like I was looking at somebody else's home. Vanessa parked the SUV and immediately checked her phone before stepping out. Ethan grabbed my small overnight bag from the back seat without saying a word. I followed them slowly up the front walk, my knees aching from the cold. The moment Vanessa opened the front door, I stopped breathing for a second. 3 large cardboard boxes sat in the entryway beside the staircase. My winter coats were folded on top of one of them. I recognized the blue knitted blanket my sister made for me 20 years ago sticking out from another box. "I packed your things this morning," Vanessa said casually, hanging her purse by the door. "I figured it would make tonight easier." Easier? I looked around the living room in silence. Every trace of me was gone. The framed photo of Daniel and me at Niagara Falls had disappeared from the mantel. My reading glasses were no longer beside the lamp near the couch. Even the Afghan I kept draped over my recliner was missing. Ethan stood frozen near the staircase. "Mom," he said carefully. "Grandma just got back from the funeral." Vanessa sighed like she was already exhausted by the conversation. "And I am trying to help her transition peacefully. Dragging this out is not healthy for anyone." I walked slowly toward the boxes and touched the edge of one with my fingertips. My entire life reduced to cardboard and packing tape. 40 years of motherhood. Holidays. Birthdays. School plays. Sunday dinners. All compressed into neat little containers waiting by the door. I noticed one box labeled bathroom in black marker. Another said donate. Donate. The words settled heavily in my chest. Vanessa moved toward the kitchen, removing her gloves one finger at a time. "The motel is only 15 minutes away," she said over her shoulder. "I paid for 3 nights. After that, I assume you will make other arrangements." Ethan looked horrified. "Where's Grandma supposed to go?" Vanessa opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. "She is an adult, Ethan. I am sure she will figure something out." I studied her quietly from across the room. Her voice was calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. And suddenly I realized something that made my stomach tighten. This had not been an impulsive decision made through grief. The boxes were too organized. The room was too clean. She had planned this before we ever buried Daniel. I slipped off my damp coat and folded it carefully over the arm of the couch. Then I looked at Ethan and forced a small smile. "Do not worry about me," I said softly. "Your grandmother has survived hard things before." But deep down, something cold had already begun to awaken inside me. Something quieter than grief. Something far more dangerous. That night, I stayed awake listening to the sound of rain hitting the motel window beside my bed. The maple crest smelled faintly of old carpet and lemon disinfectant. A flickering lamp stood near the television, casting weak yellow light across the room. I sat on the edge of the mattress, still wearing the same black funeral dress, because I could not bring myself to unpack. My suitcase rested near the door beside the cardboard box Ethan had insisted on carrying to the car for me. Inside it were pieces of a life that suddenly no longer seemed welcome anywhere. Around midnight, I opened the box and found my old family photo albums stacked beneath sweaters and winter scarves. I had not looked through them in years. My fingers moved slowly across the worn leather covers while the heater rattled softly beneath the window. The first album opened to Christmas Morning, 1998. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor wearing red flannel pajamas while holding up a toy toolbox he begged for all December. I remembered how proud he looked when he used those plastic tools to fix kitchen cabinets beside his father. I smiled without meaning to. Then I turned another page and saw Vanessa for the first time. Thanksgiving, 2007. She stood beside Daniel in a cream-colored sweater, smiling brightly while carving turkey in my kitchen. Back then, I had been grateful he found someone confident and ambitious. She brought expensive wine to dinner and always offered to help clean afterward. Everyone said she was charming. Looking at the photographs now, I realized something unsettling. In every picture after they married, I slowly disappeared from the center of the family. At first it was subtle. I stood near the edges during vacations, then birthdays, then holidays. One year, I noticed there were no pictures of me at all during Easter brunch, even though I had cooked half the meal. Another Christmas, Vanessa insisted they spend the holiday in Aspen with her side of the family instead. Daniel promised we would celebrate together the following week. We never did. The cancellations always came wrapped in polite excuses. The kids are overwhelmed. Schedules are difficult. We are trying to simplify the holidays this year. Small sentences, soft voices, quiet exclusions. I closed the album and stared at the motel wall for a long time. The truth felt almost embarrassing now. I had spent years convincing myself not to notice. Every slight, every forgotten invitation, every empty chair at Thanksgiving. Because mothers do that sometimes. We protect the people we love from uncomfortable truths, even when those truths are slowly breaking our hearts. Around 1:30 in the morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a social media notification from Vanessa. I almost ignored it. Then curiosity got the better of me. I opened the app and saw she had already posted photos from the funeral reception at the house. There was a picture of guests gathered around the dining room table holding coffee cups and paper plates of pie. Another showed Vanessa standing beside the fireplace with her church friends, smiling gently beneath the caption, "Family gives us strength during difficult seasons." I stared at the screen quietly. Not one photograph included me. Not even the funeral reception after my own son's burial. My chest tightened, but I did not cry. Instead, I enlarged one of the pictures and noticed something strange sitting near the hallway entrance behind the guests. More cardboard boxes. The same kind stacked by the front door earlier that evening. Only these were labeled in black marker with different words. Storage. Donation. Garage sale. I lowered the phone slowly into my lap. Then I realized Vanessa had not just prepared for me to leave the house. She had already begun erasing me from it. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of trucks moving along the highway outside. The motel. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I saw the patterned motel curtains, the small coffee machine on the counter, and the black funeral shoes placed neatly beside the bed. Reality settled over me again like cold fog. I made myself a weak cup of coffee and sat by the window watching pale morning lights spread across the parking lot. An elderly man walked slowly toward his pickup carrying a paper bag from the diner next door. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary lives continuing as if my world had not collapsed 48 hours earlier. Around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Can I come see you before school?" I stared at the message for several seconds before replying yes. 20 minutes later, I heard a soft knock at the door. Ethan stood outside wearing a gray hoodie and carrying his backpack over one shoulder. His hair was damp from the rain. He looked exhausted. "I brought you breakfast," he said quietly, holding up a small paper bag from McDonald's. The smell of coffee and warm biscuits filled the room after he stepped inside. I had not realized how hungry I was until then. Ethan placed the food carefully on the small table near the window and glanced around the motel room with visible discomfort. "Grandma, I am really sorry about all this." I forced a gentle smile. "None of this is your fault." He sat across from me while I unwrapped the sandwich slowly. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan reached into the front pocket of his backpack and pulled out an old cell phone with a cracked black case. "I found this in Dad's desk drawer last night," he said. "Mom told me to throw it away," but his voice faded. I looked down at the phone. Daniel's old phone. The one he replaced nearly a year earlier. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Ethan slid it across the table toward me. "There are voice recordings on it," he said carefully. "I think one of them is for you." My fingers hesitated before touching the device. The screen lit up weakly after Ethan entered the passcode. Daniel had used the same 4 numbers since high school. I swallowed hard and opened the audio folder. There were dozens of recordings, grocery reminders, work notes, random thoughts saved during traffic. Then I saw one dated 3 weeks before his death, simply labeled Mom. I pressed play. Static crackled softly for a second before Daniel's voice filled the tiny motel room. "Mom, if you are listening to this, something probably happened before I got the chance to fix things." I stopped breathing. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the floor. Daniel sounded tired. Older somehow. "I know Vanessa and you have never really gotten along, but I need you to know something. None of this was supposed to happen like this." There was a long pause on the recording. I could hear him exhale slowly. "If anything happens to me, do not let anyone push you out of that house. Promise me that." My hand trembled against the phone. Daniel continued, speaking in a quieter voice. "The house situation is complicated, and I should have explained it sooner. I kept putting it off because I thought there would be more time." The recording ended abruptly there. Just silence. I stared at the dark screen while my heartbeat echoed loudly in my ears. Ethan looked at me nervously. "What did Dad mean?" he asked softly. I lifted my eyes toward the rain sliding down the motel window. For the first time since the funeral, grief shifted slightly inside me. Beneath it, something sharper began taking shape. Because suddenly I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. Daniel had been trying to warn me, and Vanessa was hiding something. After Ethan left for school, I sat alone in the motel room replaying Daniel's recording over and over again. Each time I listened, I noticed something different in his voice. Hesitation, exhaustion, regret. My son had always been the kind of man who tried to keep peace inside a room, even when it slowly destroyed him. As a child, he used to apologize after arguments he did not start. As a husband, I suspected he spent years smoothing over tensions between Vanessa and me instead of confronting them directly. But this recording felt different. This was not guilt. This was warning. Around 10 that morning, I called Richard Conway, the attorney who had handled my late husband's estate nearly 12 years. Earlier, Richard was 74 now and semi-retired, but his receptionist still recognized my name immediately. She squeezed me into his schedule for that afternoon. I spent the next several hours sitting beside the motel window watching traffic move through sheets of cold rain while trying to organize my thoughts. By 2 o'clock, I drove across town to Richard's office building near downtown Cincinnati. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Everything looked exactly as I remembered. Dark wood walls, brass elevator doors, framed photographs of the city skyline from decades ago. Richard greeted me personally when I stepped off the elevator. His silver hair had thinned considerably since I last saw him, but his voice remained steady and warm. "Helen," he said softly, shaking my hand. I was very sorry to hear about Daniel. I nodded once because speaking still felt difficult. Richard led me into his office and closed the door behind us. Rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking the street below. "Now," he said carefully after we sat down, "tell me what happened." I explained everything slowly. The funeral, the motel, the boxes by the door, Daniel's recording. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with every sentence. When I finally finished, he removed his glasses and folded his hands together. "Helen," he said quietly, "there is something you may not fully remember about Harold's estate planning. My late husband had always handled financial matters personally. During the final years of his illness, I signed paperwork when asked but rarely involved myself in details." Richard opened a large filing cabinet near the wall and removed several thick folders. He placed them carefully on the desk between us. "Your husband established a family trust 6 months before he passed away," he explained. "The Whitmore property was transferred into that trust immediately." I frowned slightly. "But Daniel and Vanessa moved into the house after Harold died." Richard nodded. "Yes, Daniel was granted beneficiary residency rights under specific conditions." He slid one document toward me and tapped a highlighted paragraph with his pen. "However, legal ownership never transferred out of the trust itself." I stared at the paperwork without speaking. My pulse began beating harder in my chest. "Who controls the trust now?" I asked slowly. Richard looked directly at me. "You do." Silence filled the room. Outside the office window, cars moved through wet streets far below us while the city carried on with ordinary life. But inside that office, something inside me shifted permanently. Richard continued speaking in a calm professional tone. "After your husband passed away, you became sole acting trustee of the estate. Daniel was never the owner of that house, Helen. And legally speaking," he paused carefully, "Vanessa has absolutely no authority to remove you from the property." I lowered my eyes toward the stack of papers in front of me. Suddenly Daniel's voice from the motel recording echoed through my mind again. "Do not let anyone push you out of that house." I finally understood why he sounded afraid. By the time I returned to the motel that evening, the rain had finally stopped. The clouds hanging over Cincinnati had broken apart just enough for pale orange light to spill across the highway. I sat inside my car for several minutes staring at the folder Richard gave me before finally carrying it upstairs to room 214. The heating system hummed softly when I entered. The room still smelled faintly of stale coffee and detergent, but something about it no longer felt temporary. Earlier that morning, I had arrived there feeling discarded. Now I carried documents proving I had been deceived. I placed the folder carefully on the small round table beside the window and began reading every page slowly. Trust agreements, property records, amendments signed by Harold during the final months of his illness. Richard had highlighted the sections that mattered most. The Whitmore residence legally belonged to the family trust. I was the acting trustee. Daniel had residency rights tied to his marriage and continued occupancy, but ownership had never transferred. Vanessa's name appeared nowhere except as Daniel's spouse. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes briefly. For years, I had allowed myself to believe I was merely a guest in that house. I paid for groceries, helped with utilities, folded laundry, cooked dinners 3 nights a week after Daniel's long shifts at the hospital. I made myself smaller so I would not become a burden. Meanwhile, Vanessa slowly acted as if she owned every room beneath that roof. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table. A social media notification. Vanessa had posted again. I opened the app carefully. There she stood in my kitchen smiling beside two women from church while arranging white flowers in a vase near the sink. The caption read, "Trying to find peace after heartbreaking loss. Grateful for supportive friends and fresh beginnings." Fresh beginnings. My eyes drifted toward the background of the photo. One of the walls near the dining room looked strangely empty. Then I realized why. The framed family portrait Harold paid for 15 years earlier was gone. The portrait used to hang there year-round. Vanessa had removed it less than 3 days after Daniel's funeral. I enlarged the image further. Another detail caught my attention this time. Sitting near the back hallway was a stack of real estate brochures. Bright, glossy covers with photographs of waterfront condos in Florida, Naples, Sarasota, Clearwater Beach. My stomach tightened. She was planning to leave Ohio entirely. Suddenly, dozens of small memories clicked together inside my mind like puzzle pieces finally forming a picture. The storage boxes, the rushed eviction, the false kindness at church, the way Vanessa never cried at the funeral unless people were watching. She had not panicked after Daniel's death. She had prepared for it. Around 7 o'clock, Ethan called me quietly from his bedroom. "Mom has been meeting with some realtor all week," he whispered. I could hear his bedroom door locked behind him. They were talking about selling the house. I looked toward the folder beside me. "Did your father know?" I asked carefully. Ethan hesitated. "I do not think so. Dad and Mom were arguing a lot before he died. Mostly about money." He lowered his voice further. "Grandma, Mom told Aunt Cheryl today that you decided to move into assisted living. Because you wanted independence." I closed my eyes slowly. Assisted living. Independence. Vanessa was building a story around my disappearance before anyone could ask questions. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly. Ethan was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Grandma." "Yes. Dad would not have wanted this." Neither of us spoke after that. I stared through the motel window at headlights moving across the dark parking lot below, while Daniel's voice echoed once more inside my mind. "Do not let anyone push you out of that house." And for the first time since his funeral, I stopped feeling like a grieving mother begging for a place to belong. I started thinking like the woman who legally owned everything Vanessa was trying to take. 2 days later, Vanessa announced a family dinner at the house. Ethan texted me that morning while I was eating dry toast beside the motel window. "Mom invited people from church tonight. She says it is to celebrate moving forward as a family." I stared at the message for a long time before setting my phone down quietly. Celebrate. The word felt almost cruel after everything that had happened. Around noon, Richard called to tell me he had finalized copies of every trust document and property record I might need. "I strongly suggest you do not confront her emotionally," he said carefully over the phone. "People like Vanessa tend to prepare for emotional reactions. They do not prepare for paperwork." I almost smiled at that. By 6 o'clock, the sky outside had turned dark blue with early winter clouds. I stood in front of the motel mirror fastening the pearl earrings Harold bought me for our 35th anniversary. My hands were steady now, not because I felt calm, but because grief had burned itself into something colder, more focused. I wore a navy wool coat and carried the leather folder Richard prepared beneath my arm. When I pulled into the driveway, the house glowed warmly against the dark evening like nothing bad had ever happened there. Cars lined both sides of the street. Through the front windows, I could see people laughing near the dining room table while soft jazz played in the background. Vanessa had always been talented at creating appearances. The moment I stepped inside, conversations faltered slightly. Several church friends looked surprised to see me. One older woman touched my arm gently. "Helen, dear, Vanessa told us you decided to move into a retirement community." I held her gaze calmly. "Did she?" The woman blinked awkwardly and stepped aside. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air. My dining room table had been decorated with white candles and polished silverware. Vanessa stood near the kitchen island wearing a cream-colored sweater and a soft smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Helen," she said brightly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I did not realize you were coming tonight." I removed my gloves slowly. I was under the impression this was still my home. Silence flickered briefly across the room before Vanessa laughed lightly, as if I had made a harmless joke. "Of course," she replied quickly. "We are all just trying to support each other through this transition." Transition. Another carefully chosen word. Ethan appeared near the staircase, looking visibly relieved that I had arrived. He hugged me tightly before whispering, "Mom has been showing people real estate listings all afternoon." I patted his shoulder gently and walked toward the dining room. On the far wall, the large family portrait Harold commissioned years ago was gone completely now. In its place hung a modern abstract painting Vanessa bought last spring. It struck me then how thoroughly she had already begun redecorating the life Daniel left behind. Dinner began with polite conversation and forced smiles. Vanessa moved gracefully around the room, refilling wine glasses and thanking guests for their support. Anyone watching would have believed she was a grieving widow holding her family together with strength and dignity. Halfway through dessert, she tapped her fork gently against a glass. "Before everyone leaves," she announced warmly, "I just wanted to thank you all for supporting our family during this difficult chapter." She placed one hand dramatically against her chest. "Helen has decided this is the perfect time to begin an exciting new phase of independence." Several guests nodded sympathetically toward me. Vanessa continued smiling. "Sometimes healing means letting go and allowing younger generations to move forward." I looked around the table slowly. The candles flickered against familiar faces while rain began tapping softly against the windows again. Then I placed my napkin carefully beside my plate and stood up without rushing. "Actually," I said quietly, "there is something important everyone here should probably understand before this evening continues." The room became completely still after I stood up from the table. Even the soft jazz playing from the kitchen speakers suddenly felt distant. Vanessa remained frozen beside the dining room chair with her wine glass still raised slightly in her hand. The candlelight reflected against her expressionless face while guests shifted uncomfortably around the table. I rested one hand lightly on the leather folder beneath my arm and looked slowly around the room. These were people who had attended Christmas dinners in this house for years. People who brought casseroles after Harold died. People who watched Daniel grow up from a little boy riding bicycles down this street. And now most of them looked embarrassed simply because they realized they had been told only half the story. "I apologize if there has been confusion," I said calmly, "but I have not chosen to leave this home." Vanessa let out a quick, nervous laugh. "Helen, maybe this is not really the time." "Actually," I interrupted gently, "I think this is exactly the time." The room fell silent again. I opened the folder slowly and removed several documents Richard had prepared earlier that afternoon. The paper sounded unusually loud against the quiet dining room. Vanessa lowered her glass onto the table. For the first time all evening, I noticed uncertainty flicker across her face. "A few days ago," I continued, "I was informed that I no longer had a place in this house after my son's funeral." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One older man near the fireplace cleared his throat awkwardly. I continued anyway. "What Vanessa failed to mention is that this property legally belongs to the Whitmore Family Trust." Vanessa's expression tightened immediately. "Helen," she said carefully through a strained smile, "you are upsetting people." I looked directly at her. "No, the truth is upsetting people." Ethan stared at his mother from across the room, his face pale beneath the dining room lights. I handed copies of the documents to the couple seated nearest me. "You are welcome to read the highlighted sections." The husband adjusted his glasses and lowered his eyes toward the paperwork while his wife leaned closer beside him. I watched confusion spread slowly across their faces. Then surprise. Richard had prepared everything clearly. Trustee designation, ownership records, residency conditions, every signature notarized and dated. Vanessa stepped toward me quickly now, her voice dropping lower. "This conversation should be private." I folded my hands calmly in front of me. "You made it public when you announced my departure to half the neighborhood." For a brief second, nobody moved. Rain tapped softly against the windows while silverware and untouched dessert plates sat scattered across the table between us. Then the man holding the paperwork finally looked up. "Helen is the trustee?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. "And always has been since my husband passed away." Vanessa's composure cracked almost invisibly after that. Not dramatically, just enough for those paying attention to notice. Her shoulders stiffened. Her jaw tightened. "Daniel handled all financial matters," she said sharply. "You do not understand how any of this works." I met her eyes steadily. "Apparently I understand it better than you thought." Ethan suddenly stood up from his chair near the staircase. "Dad knew," he said quietly into the silence. Every face in the room turned toward him. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, but his voice remained clear. He left a recording for Grandma before he died. Vanessa turned toward her son, so quickly her chair scraped across the hardwood floor. Ethan, enough. But he did not sit down. Dad said nobody was supposed to force Grandma out of this house. The words settled heavily across the dining room. I watched several guests slowly lower their eyes while realization spread through the room piece by piece. Vanessa had not been protecting the family. She had been removing an obstacle. And for the first time since Daniel's funeral, she could no longer control the story. People began leaving not long after that. Quietly, awkwardly. One couple gathered their coats without finishing dessert. Another woman from church squeezed my hand near the doorway and whispered, "I did not know." Neither did I almost said. Not completely. Not until grief forced me to open my eyes. Vanessa remained near the dining room table while guests drifted out of the house in uncomfortable silence. The carefully staged evening she had built around sympathy and appearances was collapsing piece by piece right in front of her. By 9:30, only the three of us remained downstairs. Rain continued falling softly outside while dirty dishes sat untouched beside half-melted candles on the table. Ethan disappeared upstairs without another word after muttering goodnight. I could hear his bedroom door close gently overhead. Vanessa stood at the kitchen island with both hands pressed flat against the marble countertop. Her makeup still looked flawless beneath the recessed lights, but the warmth had vanished from her expression completely. "You humiliated me tonight," she said finally without looking at me. I removed my coat slowly and draped it over the back of a chair. "No," I replied quietly. "I corrected you." She let out a bitter laugh beneath her breath. "You really want to do this now? After Daniel just died?" I looked around the kitchen that once belonged to my husband. The copper pots hanging above the stove. The curtains I sewed 20 years ago. The scratch near the pantry door where Daniel crashed his bicycle indoors at age 12. Memories filled every inch of that room. "You told a grieving mother to pack her bags the day she buried her son," I said calmly. "Do not speak to me about timing." Vanessa finally looked at me then. Anger flickered openly across her face for the first time since the funeral. "Daniel was gone," she snapped. "Everything changed." I held her gaze steadily. "No, your behavior changed because you thought nobody would stop you." Silence settled heavily between us after that. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background while rainwater slid down the dark kitchen windows. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "What happens now?" she asked coldly. I walked toward the dining room and picked up the leather folder from the table. Then I removed one final document Richard prepared earlier that afternoon. "Legally," I said evenly, "you have 30 days to make new living arrangements unless we agree otherwise." Her face lost color almost instantly. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious." She stared at me in disbelief. "This is my home." I thought about the motel key she pressed into my hand beside Daniel's grave. Room 214. Maple Crest Inn. Learn to survive on your own. I folded the document carefully before placing it back inside the folder. "A few days ago," I said softly, "you told me something important." Vanessa remained silent. "You said I needed to learn how to survive alone." I paused briefly. I did. The kitchen felt very still then. Not triumphant. Not joyful. Just quiet in the way storms become quiet after finally breaking apart. Vanessa looked away first. Her eyes moved toward the dark hallway leading upstairs where Ethan slept behind a closed bedroom door. For the first time since Daniel died, she looked uncertain about the future she had planned so carefully. I picked up my coat and slipped it back over my shoulders. "I am staying in my room tonight," I said calmly. "The one at the end of the hallway. The room my husband and I paid for." Then I turned off the dining room light and walked slowly upstairs. As I passed the family photographs lining the staircase wall, I stopped briefly beside the oldest one. Harold stood smiling between Daniel and me on a summer afternoon decades ago. Before ambition, before resentment, before family became something fragile enough to break. I touched the edge of the frame gently before continuing upstairs toward my room. Because in the end, losing my son nearly destroyed me. But losing the illusion of who my family truly was may have saved me.